I'm here with Jim Wangers. And what'd you bring to the Concours today?
Well, as a matter of fact, I didn't bring a car, but I brought a guy. And the guy is standing right next to me, Mr. Tenney Fairchild, who happens to own what I will consider the most famous GTO ever created. Tenny, I'm going to ask you to say a few words about this car and what it means to you to have it.
Okay, hand that rascal over. For me, it started out as a little guy. And my dad used to work with Jim Wangers at the ad agency in Detroit, and he'd take me into the office, and Jim would give me these promotional model cars, and we knew he had this cool car out in the garage. Now, this would be 1964, so I was a little meatster. And my recollection is stuck to that back glass like a Garfield, and that turned me on to fast cars from the get-go. And it turns out there's even a bigger history than that, but my personal history is pretty big to me. And Jim can fill you in on the rest of the details of why the car exists, because it would not exist were it not for he.
Can you fill us in on that?
I certainly can. Well, this is indeed a very, very special GTO. We introduced the car in 1964, hung the name GTO on it, which already had received some significant press. The name itself belonged to the FIA, the Federation International Automobile, who used it as a racing class. A rather famous car maker out of Italy, Ferrari, had already gathered the name for a model of their own. But they didn't own it, which did allow then for Pontiac to use it on their very special car. And this is indeed a very special car. In 1964, Pontiac introduced its first front-engine, rear-drive, intermediate-sized car, which was called at that time Tempest. The Highline model was called Le Mans. The idea of stuffing a big engine into a small car, while not necessarily original, having been done by the hot rod community for many years, was picked up by Pontiac and given the name of this special new mid-size car, which now featured a 389 cubic inch engine instead of the 326 cubic inch engine, which was standard in the Tempest and the Le Mans. The result was an outstanding car with absolute mind-blowing performance, available for $2,500 for just about anybody that had the money or had the credit to come in and buy one. What we decided to do was to see if we couldn't get a leading magazine. In this case, it was Car and Driver magazine, to do a comparison, in a sense really a tongue-in-cheek comparison, between this new upstart $2,500 Pontiac and what was perhaps at that time, and maybe even today, the greatest serious supercar ever produced, the famed Ferrari GTO. Car and Driver magazine agreed to do it and compared then this $2,500 Pontiac with this very, very expensive and very, very renowned Ferrari GTO, just because they shared the name GTO. Well, the reality is that this car, the car that I'm standing in front of, was exactly the same car. Not a likeness, not a similarity, the exact car that was used in that comparison test way back in 1964 by Car and Driver magazine. This was a very special GTO. In fact, it was so special that we were able to put a 421 cubic inch engine into it, which replaced the 389. Only those who really knew and really understood what to look for could spot the difference. Obviously, the folks at Car and Driver did not spot the difference. The car performed magnificently, and although it didn't beat the Ferrari, It was competitive and established an image which got the GTO off the ground like no other car in American automotive history.
Little GTO, we're really looking fine. 3 deuces and a 4-speed and a 389. Listen to her tacking up now. Listen to her whine. When you turn it on, wind it up, blow it up, GTO. Yeah, baby. There you go.
We're going to look at this very special GTO and point out some of the specific differences that made it so competitive when it was compared to that Ferrari. As we look at the engine, you can't tell it by looking at it, but it is actually a 421 cubic inch engine, which was just flat not available in the GTO in 1964, except that it was in this car. Looking at it from the exterior, unless you know exactly what you're looking at, there is no way that you can tell the difference. Now, the car was painted in the popular red color that was very famous for the GTO in that year. Buccaneer Red was its name. Other than the fact that it enjoyed the special spinner wheel cover, it did not have any exterior differences. You again can't see any visual differences between a production GTO in this beautiful red color until you see it identified as a Royal Bobcat, which meant that it had been through the service department at the famous performance dealership in Royal Oak, Michigan, Royal Pontiac, who had fathered the Royal Bobcat package, which in effect in the 1960s was nothing more than a series of high-performance modifications that almost anybody could do to a car. They put richer carburetor jets. They opened up the air cleaner so it took in more air. They gave it the lock nuts on the rocker arms, which prevented the hydraulic lifters from pumping up. Obviously, the car was equipped with a dual exhaust. It had the famous tri-power option, which was the 3 two-barrel carburetor option. Very, very famous for Pontiac at the time. It was equipped with a dual exhaust system. Nothing but the standard dual exhaust, which was reasonably functional and gave the car enough breathing to be able to take advantage of the changes, the modifications that were made that didn't make the car into a race car, just made it a very satisfying, good performing street car. One of the things that is very, very significant and very specific are what we call the exhaust splitters, which in 1964 were a very popular option. Now, that didn't mean that there was 2 exhaust systems on either side of the car. That simply was an extension to the exhaust pipe that came back on this side of the car and was put through what we called a splitter, which gave it the look of 4 exhaust pipes on the car, 2 on each side. It was a styling option and turned out to be very, very popular. Perhaps the most exciting part of this car is to drive it. Let's open the door and take a look at what is really a very normal kind of a bucket seat configuration. It did not have a console because we were trying to save weight, to try to keep the car looking as stock as it could be without actually carrying any extra weight. A console, for example, would have added 30 pounds. The car itself, other than the fact that it had a very, very finely tuned street engine, did not give any idea or project any characteristics that would suggest that it was something special, that it was in fact a race car. In fact, it was a real sleeper, which is exactly what it was designed to be. And it got to the point, particularly in the Detroit area where these cars were manufactured, that any car that carried a Royal Bobcat emblem was generally considered to be a pretty exciting car and one which you maybe didn't want to mess with. The other option, which was part of this package, was what we called our wood sport steering wheel. Now, of course, it was designed to look like wood, but it was, in fact, a plastic wheel. But it gave the look of a real classic wood steering wheel. At that particular time, there was some pretty severe negatives surrounding wood steering wheels, as they had a history of breaking and cracking in the event of any kind of an accident or any kind of an interruption. In my closing discussion about this particular car, I would like to point out that this car and driver story, comparing this Pontiac at $2,500 to this magnificent Ferrari, turned out to be one of the most successful promotions that Pontiac, or perhaps any Detroit manufacturer, ever pulled off. The car suddenly gained an attention factor. It became respected by the performance enthusiasts regardless of age, and at its attractive price became an immediate seller. Initially, when Pontiac brought out the car, they had only intended to build 5,000. They had 5,000 sold within the first 30 days after it was in the dealerships. And so they turned around and increased the production to the point where they built over 32,000 in 1964. Now, as far as that special engine that was in this car and is still in this car, the car and driver folks actually, while maybe suspecting that this was a pretty special car by the way it performed, never really had it confirmed that there was anything special about this engine until I released my book, Glory Days, in 1998. Now, bear in mind, this test was conducted in 1963. And it was in 1998 when I revealed that, yes, indeed, we had a 421 cubic inch engine in this car. While it was a big laugh and kind of a ho-ho in the automotive community, the car and driver folks were a little bit upset and felt that they had been deceived by what they thought was a very responsible car maker, Pontiac. My answer to that, of course, is that whatever.